exclusively on Secular Media Network. This is the Gaytheist Manifesto.
Hello and welcome to the Gaytheist Manifesto, your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. I'm your host, Callie Wright, and today we are having a discussion about race. I have two guests on who are awesome people that I have lots and lots of respect for. I have Mandisa Thomas, who is the founder and current president of Black Nonbelievers, and I have Alix Jules, who is the other guy at Dogma Debate and has a blog named The Graffiti Wall on Pathos. Both of you, welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you very much. Pleasure.
So, Mandisa, some fun stuff happened at a convention this last weekend. And this kind of ties into something that I wanted to talk about anyways, which is what seems to be the assumption that black people are religious by default. And so I have a feeling what happened kind of ties into that. So if you could just kind of talk to me about what happened.
Sure. This past weekend was the Atheist Alliance of America's conference, which was held at the Crowne Plaza Atlanta Airport. And first, let me say that we received word before I got there on a Friday evening that there was a Women of Color Ministries conference taking place at the same hotel. And that on Friday morning, they were walking past the registration table for our conference and either giving some very mean stares, walking past and praying over the table and rebuking folks. And so I actually got a bit excited because we couldn't wait to come and say, well, they're going to love our table then. If they hate their tables, and they're really going to love us. So, so I set up and I was ready for Saturday morning. And there were, in addition to that conference, there were some other conferences there too. And, they were all predominantly Black attended and facilitated. And so on that day, we engaged in some good conversations. Bridget was there, Bria Crutchfield. She was another speaker. And some of the women and men who stopped by our table, they had some very curious questions. There were some who, tried to defend their faith and, they gave other reasons why they believed, but the conversations weren't hostile. So Sunday afternoon, during the Sunday Assemblies event, I came back to the table for a moment, and there was a woman who approached me, and so she was looking at it, and you could tell the disgust was on her face, and so I was about to start speaking to her, and then she turned away, and then after a few minutes came back and said, "Well, why Black Nonbelievers? I just want to know why." And so when I introduced myself and I told her, the premise of my organization, and told her that, we've always been a presence in the community. And she proceeded to tell me how educated she was and that she had a PhD and that atheism is just another religion. And so that bothered me. And I said, well, one of the things I said was, you don't have to be disrespectful to me. And why did I say that? Because she said, you're raising your voice at me and I'm not doing that to you. But since you want to get loud, I will get loud right back. And she said, I cannot believe you are letting these white people manipulate you. You have a slave mentality and this is witchcraft.
Wait, she was saying this to you?
Yes, she was.
Okay. I rebuke thee, Mandisa. I rebuke thee.
Yes, she said I had a slave mentality, and as a Black woman, I was supposed to know that God brought us through, because how dare I reject God as a Black woman? And I said, well, I'm like, which one? First of all, there's so many gods out there. And I basically said I pitied her. And when I said that, she proceeded to say that she felt sorry for my kids and my mother. I mean, she brought the mama into it, mama and the kids. So, and she said, and then some of the other attendees were there, because I had to point to them. I said, now, do you see this here? Do you understand now what we go through? And she said, well, I don't talk to white demons, and I rebuke you all, and I'm going to bathe you all in the blood of Jesus. Oh, my goodness.
Wow.
And but two of Matthew Facciani and Garrett Lovejoy, Jennifer Lovejoy's husband, I didn't realize that they started recording the incident, because the woman was just going nuts.
Right.
And, I just said, wow, if there was ever a confirmation of what it is that we experience, if they are eyeballing you guys at the Atheist Convention, just imagine how some of them will react to us. Now, some for our presence made it a bit more palatable to approach, but for women like her, she was more disgusted. So it really did show. It was an eye opener for those who were there. First of all, they were horrified at her behavior, as they should have been. But it was an eye opener. And like I said during my presentation, if you didn't understand before what we go through, now you do.
For sure. And so, Alex, let me bring you into the conversation here. Where does that attitude stem from, do you think?
Well, I know exactly where it stems from. It stems from identity, and in particular, the African American identity, and how we define and cohere who we are. I mean, we've spoken about this for years. We've tried to define it. We've written about it for years. Many people can accept the idea of separation of church and state, but for African Americans, it's very difficult to separate the idea of church and race. So when we start looking at how African Americans, in particular, identify or define what it means to be Black, for many of them, there is no separating this idea of Christianity in particular. I mean, dissonance is strong in this particular woman, but you need that level of religiosity, and it is constantly reaffirmed through stereotypes and cultural biases and cultural coherence. We know and understand that. So when African Americans define who they are, there is a very strong polarity to Christianity, and it's just who they've always been. And I say, always been since they were allowed to define who they were, and that always tends to, if we can ever get to that level of the conversation, because I've been in the same situations as Mandisa has and Bria has, and most Black non-believers who put themselves out there deal with the same issues. The settings are different, but the arguments are the same, right? I mean, I've been in situations with pastors who have justified slavery, who have literally justified slavery as a means to bring the message of God and Jesus, the Word, to African Americans, because, of course, that makes perfect logical sense, right? There wasn't a better delivery mechanism than chattel slavery to get the message of Jesus loves you, rather than potentially millions of Africans dying in the journey, and hundreds of years of actual slavery and then Jim Crow on top of that, to to show you that Jesus loves you. I mean, there's no better way of doing that. But, again, that dissonance is strong and it's tied to cultural identity. So we've been fighting it for years. It's something that, Mandy and I and Bree and most Black non-believers, deal with on a constant basis. It's nothing new. It's just something that we need to continue to challenge, and the growth of organizations like Black Nonbelievers and the rising visibility of groups like Black Nonbelievers, Black Skeptics, etc. Those are beginning to get in the face, just as we see in the general population. Those groups are beginning to challenge that norm, and that's how you really begin to address what the normative standard of belief or racial identity really is.
Right.
Say that you're not.
Right. So, something that I run into often doing, LGBT activism is I run into people who, say that their faith got them through whatever oppression is attached to being gay or being trans. And that's, the only thing that they have to hold on to. And, I'm sure, people who live under the worst consequences of racism, probably sometimes have the same stories. And sometimes I don't know whether to be angry or empathetic. Is that something that sounds familiar to you as, trying to kind of walk that line between trying to understand where people are coming from, and, having to deal with this systemic oppression, versus recognizing that, this religion is part of that in so many ways?
It's a fine line because when you're dealing with the realities of being a real minority in the U.S. and the disparities in living and inequality, et cetera, that are very, very real, people need to satiate and satisfy and get through their lives sometimes by holding on to those beliefs. And who am I to take those away? Now, if you need that to get through life, that's fine. But that fine line is when you decide that, and this is the truth in any discussion, in any discourse when it comes to religion, but when you decide that you're going to cross the line and you're going to attack me or you're going to attack Mandisa in the way that she was attacked, and she was verbally assailed. Absolutely, that's when you're human. I know I would have probably lost it a little bit. Yes, I feel empathy for, but how dare you try and tell me who I am? Especially given the history that we have, it's something that we talk about. Blackness is not monolithic. Humanity isn't monolithic. We can cohere and define who we are as individuals, and so I definitely walk that line, and it's a constant tension on should I give or should I really give? You know what I'm saying? So, Manny, what do you think?
Yes, I'm going to say that it can be very, very tough at times because you're looking at an institution that we acknowledge played a significant role within our community historically, especially at a time when the laws were effectively turned against us. We acknowledged that the church did play a significant role when it came to certain matters pertaining to the community. However, the doctrine itself, knowing that it was used to enslave us, knowing that the church, especially now in our communities, is generating billions of dollars. It has generated billions of dollars. And we're still in a state of despair to an extent. And we still seem to be obligated by this sense of tradition and fear. And a lot of that has to do with this institution and the doctrine in itself. And so it can be very, very frustrating at times because really the church has hijacked the legacy of the Black church in particular, it has hijacked the legacy of our communities, in that many Black folks don't know about that there has always been diversity within our community. We seem to have adopted this narrative of the struggle, which struggle has been a part of it, but there has been a lot of triumph as well, and that triumph is attributed to some God. And it's frustrating because, that was only, sure, people of faith, were involved, but certainly it does not have the right to define the legacy and the narrative of our community. And also, people don't have the right to push these ideals on others. And when someone rightfully questions the doctrine in the church, that they are pretty much lambasted or looked at like they have two heads. So this encounter in particular, and for those of us who have been involved for a while, I just think it has become so much more important that we continue to speak out, because we are actually this is actually adding to the legacy and imparting the legacy of our community.
Here's an excerpt from Nailed by David Fitzgerald.
Didn't there have to have been a Jesus? Perhaps he was just a wandering teacher or an exorcist, an apocalyptic prophet or a zealot who opposed the Romans. Perhaps he was all these things, or even a composite of several such early first-century figures. But at any rate, surely there had to be somebody at the original core of Christianity, arguably the most famous individual in human history. All this seems to be a perfectly reasonable, completely natural assumption to make, so why would anyone be so foolish as to propose that Jesus never existed? Doesn't it just make more sense to assume that there was a historical Jesus, even if we're unable to recover the real facts about his life and death? As it turns out, no. The opposite is true. The closer we look at the evidence for Jesus, the less solid evidence we find, and the more we find suspicious silences and curious resemblances to the pagan and Jewish religious ideas and philosophies that preceded Christianity. And once you begin to parse out the origins of this tradition or that teaching from their various sources, the sweater begins unraveling quickly until it becomes very difficult to buy that there ever was, or even could have been, any historical figure at the center.
Nailed by David Fitzgerald is now available at atheistaudiobooks.com.
Before we jump back into the show, it's time to thank our patrons. This week we're recognizing Dan and Alexandra. Thank you so much for believing in us enough to contribute to us financially and for being a part of this movement. Patrons of the Gaytheist Manifesto have access to all sorts of cool stuff, like a big shout out on the show, premium content, including an audio journal I've decided to keep documenting the more personal stuff I don't dive into on the show, and an exclusive patrons-only hangout once a month. If you're so inclined, head over to patreon.com/The Gaytheist Manifesto to become a part of this movement and support the show. Thank you. So we talked, we mentioned earlier about, these problems that still very much exist, regardless of, how much anyone wants to talk about the progress, quote unquote, that we've made. So, and obviously I'm not, making the mistake here of asking you to speak for all black people, because that would be silly. People do that to me about speaking for the trans community all the time. So, just, for the both of you individually, I mean, when you hear people talk about society as if we live in a post-racial society, or, when people go on and on and on about all the progress that we've made as sort of a way to dismiss when people talk about the systemic race problems that still exist, especially in this country. I mean, what does that feel like? What goes through your head when you see those things?
Can we start banging our head against the wall?
If I hear loud noises on the other side, I'll know what's going
You want to take this one first, Alex?
Yeah. Sure. We tend to be very easily duped, where we mistake the inch for the mile, and we're very optimistic creatures, and we really want to move past and beyond. And one of the arguments that we tend to hear in the atheist community pretty frequently is we have progressed to the point where racism almost doesn't exist. Really, seriously, it's an argument that happens all the time. So we shouldn't be acknowledging the idea of race at all. And so therefore we immediately discredit groups like, Black Nonbelievers because, hey, we're all human, right? So this idea of being colorblind is a chronic disease that tends to plague our community. I've been trying to remedy it for years now, but it is very difficult to hear that because the reality is that we aren't colorblind. I don't live in a society that is colorblind. I don't live in a world where people can truly acknowledge me for just being who I am, and nor can they truly dismiss. And unfortunately, they do. They try to dismiss the inequality, the inequity when it comes to wealth, when it comes to opportunity, et cetera. It can be really very, very difficult. And so when you take a look at the African American community in particular, who identifies with the struggle against the inequity and the inequality and the unfairness, et cetera, they tend to define who they are by that struggle. And when you take a look at who has been the loudest proponent of that struggle, it tends to be the African American church. And that's the case in part because they've hijacked the narrative, because there have been secular voices. There have always been secular voices, but unfortunately, they tend to be very muted in terms of modernity. We don't have the loud James Baldwin types and the Langston Hughes, et cetera, that are out there and are being allowed the ability to jump to the forefront and argue not on the base of religious standing, but regardless of religious standing. So it's been really, really tough. But again, you tend to have a problem, talking down to and shouting people that are fighting for a lot of the things that we still truly do believe in. And so we wind up having to accept much more than our white counterparts, right? I mean, we almost have to accept the civil rights leaders that happen to be religious because they have the bully pulpit. And at the end of the day, I am black before I'm an atheist, right? And so when people decide that they're going to argue with me in the street, or whether it's an issue of excessive force, police brutality, et cetera, they don't ask me what I believe in. They see my color first. And so we wind up seeing ourselves in very precarious situations as Black nonbelievers because, one, we want to tear down belief, but it's kind of hard to pull down the platform of those that are fighting for exactly the same thing that you're fighting for. And when you start looking at your allies, you start realizing that you're a lot more alone than you thought you were, especially when you leave conventions, right?
I had the fortunate experience of never having to overcome religious belief. And I also had the unique experience, and Alex can share this too, we're both from New York, that having been raised, the Christianity isn't the only thing that we have to battle in our community. I was raised in what was called the conscious community, where we learned a lot about Black history and culture and systemic racism and injustice. And so that also breeds a lot of dogma and indoctrination in itself. And so there is also this constant internal struggle for identity. Like Alex mentioned earlier, what does it mean to be Black? What does it mean? What constitutes having a Black card? There are so many things internally that we are constantly having to battle, especially as it pertains to the colorism factor, which religion and the identity of having to accept a white Jesus during slavery plays a part in. And so in addition to, the conditions, in addition to, having to consider our race, within the race itself. And we're also dealing with this notion of, well, you don't tell our secrets. These are things that you don't, these are things that we don't talk about. This tradition of sweeping things under the rug. It's what's hurting us. And it also hinders a sense of progression. And this is what many in the secular community tend to not understand when it comes to communities that have been marginalized, not just because of the religious factor, but also because of the race factor. So we're fighting dual battles here. A lot of it is external. Much of it is internal as well. And, I'm not sure at which point things will start to, I guess, level out or come together. But it does become important that we continue to reshape the narrative of our community, because really, I don't give the church a pass. I don't give it too much of a pass for being this historical institution. Because, granted, while I understand it, and I certainly, like Alex said, I certainly am not going to take someone's belief away from them if they need it. However, there are many in our community who are hurting from the fact that there are some matters that the Black community is still slow to be objective about, especially when it comes to the LGBT community, when it comes to atheism, when it comes to, and that's frustrating for us. So our groups don't exist because we're trying to be separate or that we're trying to be special. The point is that they're needed. And that's the bottom line, because there are things that we have to deal with internally, as well as if you truly say that you're serious about diversity within the secular community, because so many people are still asking, why are there still very few visible Black atheists? Then this is what we need to do, just point blank.
Absolutely.
So whether it makes you uncomfortable or not, I certainly am not the type of person who tries to make things so hard to swallow. But just to have this, this reaction to our groups existing, that definitely denotes a level of privilege in itself, because most of the people that we see do this don't have a person of color on their friends list. They certainly don't have a Black atheist on their friends list. So these are things that they've never had to think about. And it's like, okay, it's fine if you never had to deal with it before, but guess what? You have to deal with it now.
Absolutely. So you brought up the LGBT community earlier, and obviously the show's called The Gaytheist Manifesto, and I'm a queer transgender atheist, so that's a particular interest of mine. And I mean, racial justice is obviously something that's super important to me as an ally. But one thing that our community, the trans community, deals with constantly is trans women of color being murdered. And if memory serves, every trans woman of color that's been murdered this year has either been Black or Latina. So that's a huge, huge issue for us. So if either one of you want to take on just kind of talk about the issues that you see pertaining to the LGBT community in that way.
Again, the Black community is still, unfortunately, homophobic. This goes back to what I said about sweeping things under the rug. We know that it's always this common knowledge that things go on in the church. People are sleeping together. People are, these pastors are doing certain things to their congregations. They may be sleeping with women, or most of the church choir may be gay, or that that certain pastors are gay. But it, heaven forbid, for lack of a better word, that you actually talk about it. That you actually admit it. It's almost seen as a weakness that we actually be more progressive and say that we have LGBT, that we have LGBT and trans in our community, because that just isn't a part of who we are. There are certain things that are said aren't, that aren't Black things, or Black people don't do this, or Black people don't do that. Certainly being trans is one of them. And that is something that can be considered in the highly religious climate, and often hypocritical climate, can be considered very dangerous. And so people can react very violently, which is extremely unfortunate. And this is probably why this is one of the reasons why these murders are occurring. And this goes back to the this awful sense of tradition and what we're not addressing, and what we're keeping silent, and a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be LGBT and trans that people just aren't accepting because they're holding on to that religious dogma so tight.
Alex, what do you got?
This one is particularly hard because when you actually spend time with some of the surveys and the data, we get a little bit of a mixed message, because we're seeing that when it comes to homophobia specifically, the Black community is not that far off, although we tend to hear about it a lot more. The Black community isn't that much more homophobic than the general population. Now, that certainly flies in the face of what we hear and what I've experienced in conversation, etc. But again, that's a lot of rhetoric, and when it comes to the general face and visibility of who actually has the microphone, right? So if they tend to sound or tend to be a lot louder, they will be a lot louder, and it sounds as if they're talking for a much bigger piece of the community. But again, that depends on which surveys and which studies you pay attention to. Now, when it comes to the trans community, we don't have that level of data that we can make a blanket statement, except for the fact that we know that Black trans women of color are dying at a staggering rate. And not only are they being targeted, no one's being brought to justice, right? And that's actually, for me, an even bigger issue, because until we start addressing both sides of the equation, we're never going to solve for the equation, right? But that goes back to what intersectionality really is for Black women of color, or Black trans women of color, because regardless of being in the LGBTQ community, they're still Black, and because they happen to be Black, sometimes when it comes to justice, nothing is ever sought.
Here's an excerpt from The God Virus by Daryl W. Ray.
Every day, religion affects us in ways we may not realize. It makes your Uncle Ned spend hours praying for you. It gives your Baptist neighbor a reason to reject her own child who married a Catholic. It teaches your Pentecostal sister to spank her children to keep them from going to hell. It requires a Catholic priest to deny his sex drive. It causes people to give enormous amounts of money to religious organizations, and causes you to avoid talking to your cousin Jenny for fear she may try to convert you to Jehovah's Witnesses. Religion has both obvious and subtle influences on you and on society. This book explores the impact of religion on you and your world. It draws open the curtain of mystery and offers ways to understand and make informed decisions about religion. Have you ever wondered what makes religion so powerful? What makes people profess deep faith even as they act in ways that betray that faith? What makes people blind to the irrationalities of their own religion, yet see clearly the problems of other religions? How does it weave its way into our political system? If these and similar questions interest you, this book will help you understand its power in you, your family, and your culture.
The God Virus by Daryl W. Ray is available at atheistaudiobooks.com. Here's an excerpt from Mum, Dad, I'm an Atheist by David G. McAfee.
It is the same highly regarded concept of an afterlife that allows misguided religious people to justify the mistreatment of those who disagree with their religious ideologies. They are simply trying to protect you from eternal damnation in the afterlife by condemning you, insulting you, and even disowning you in this life. It is not to say that becoming open about your disbelief is always going to be met with these negative reactions, and, in fact, that is precisely what this work is hoping to prevent. But it is important to understand that if you experience negative reactions from religious kin, it is probably a result from the religion's teachings, and likely not from any personal vendetta or hatred.
Mom, Dad, I'm an Atheist by David G. McAfee is now available at atheistaudiobooks.com.
So let's talk for a minute about how, because you said if you look at the numbers, the black community doesn't seem to be all that much more homophobic than the general population, depending on the study that you look at. Do you think the visibility that surrounds, when the pastor of a prominent black church speaks out against gay marriage or something along those lines, do you think that's an example of kind of an unfair double standard? Like another example of that? Like,
it is.
You're black, I expect you to be more progressive. It absolutely
is. And this goes to, leaders, not necessarily, we see it in Congress, right? Is everyone in the U.S. or the majority of the U.S. truly homophobic and anti-equality, anti-this, etc.? No, but when you take a look at representation, it tends to be heavily skewed to a perception of right-wing religiosity. I would say almost across both parties, right? Who's right tends to be who's right, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so when we take a look at the African American community, we do see a double standard, and it is a little bit unfair. But again, we don't necessarily control the narrative of what blackness is, because again, when we start taking a look at black males, if I'm addressing every single stereotype out there, guess what? Black men go to college. Black women go to college. We have jobs. We care about our children, and we happen to care about our children just as much as other people do. But that's not the narrative that you see being portrayed in the press. So we're absolutely always dealing with some form of double standard.
Yeah, well, I remember seeing the picture of the Million Man March that happened, was it 2 or 3 weeks ago? And the caption was something along the lines of, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of black people get together to march peacefully, and the media doesn't cover it. But one brick goes through one window of a CVS, and all of a sudden it's the 24-hour news cycle.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I just thought,
absolutely.
God,
and the press doesn't, and we can talk about that brick some other time.
Right.
But then when we actually spend time talking about why that brick was thrown and what led up to that brick, what happened after that brick, and the police accountability associated with the brick being thrown, etc. We never addressed that. So the media, and I don't want to paint the media as this just evil conspiratorial entity. It's just it likes to glamorize conflict, right? And what. If it bleeds, it leads, right? And that's just something that is reality. And so when it does bubble up to the surface and to the forefront of media, people tend to buy into that. Do you honestly believe that what is fair and balanced and represented on Fox News, which is the most trusted news network in America, is any of that true? Now, most of it's not, but that's what people are going to buy into because we like boogeymen. And until we get a left-wing communist or socialistic government that we can fight against and rally everyone against, it's just going to be the other boogeymen we can find in the States.
Right.
Because we like that.
Right. Which is, it's black people, it's gay people, it's trans people, it's immigrants. Just, go down the list.
Yeah. Just, you know what? It's real simple. It's real simple. Just grab Trump's, stump speech and there you go. It's right there.
Okay, so speaking of politicians, Mandisa, we were in Myrtle Beach together at the Carolina Secular Convention a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
And I remember we were at the hotel bar afterwards, and I think everyone had a few drinks. But someone asked you a question that I thought was I laughed at the time, but then I thought to myself, like, is that even really appropriate? Someone asked you, does Ben Carson know he's black? Which is kind of a funny way to put it.
Right.
But, I think there's probably a lot to unpack there. So maybe just kind of give me your thoughts on that question.
Well, it's interesting and it's funny to me because while I am certainly disappointed in Dr. Ben Carson at this time, it's certainly that sort of question does kind of imply that, being black has a certain status, economic status or certain level to it.
Exactly.
Which and also, but also too, I'm going to say this. That there are many blacks who, will probably have asked the same question. But I'm sure Alex would agree when she
if you want a list, we can start, but we only have an hour, right?
There are some black folks who might ask the same question. But,
here's the reality, right? I find that question a little bit insulting because here you go, you have people that are trying to define what blackness is,
right? And someone who's not black doing
Ben Carson is, right? And the fact is, we do have, and people don't realize this, we do have some very, very conservative African Americans in the African American community. They don't all happen to be Republicans or Tea Party Republicans, etc. Yes, that he happens to represent a very small minority, but that doesn't mean that he's not black. In fact, if you start talking to a lot of African American ministers that are out there, and you start really delving into what they believe, you will find that they sound very much like right-wing conservatives.
Yeah. And what I was going to say is that, too, having been raised that blackness was a certain thing, I had to unlearn this idea that we are a monolith as well, or that we all had to agree on the same issues. We don't. There are some, even if I don't agree with what Ben Carson, with his position, I certainly am aware that there are many blacks who hold his position. And guess what? I'm not going to necessarily fault them for that, just because on the basis of that he's black. Mainly, now whether it is a bit, oblivious, I can definitely, I can definitely can see that, but to say that these types don't exist in our community is absolutely not true.
Or that they shouldn't exist.
Exactly. That they shouldn't.
Exactly.
And, well, it's bothersome to actually hear, people jump at African Americans, specifically when you start looking at the Black Lives Matter movement and Bernie Sanders, right? When that entire thing happened.
That was going to be my next question, so that's great.
Right. When that happened, we had people shouting down from the rooftops, don't you black people know that Bernie, really, really, really represent, and I got this long diatribe and because I happened to, I don't want to say defend, but I definitely understood what was going on, the dynamic that was going on. And no, I was not going to talk down to those activists, not necessarily that I support them, but I could not really condemn them because they don't feel as if they are part of the political machine and the political decision-making process. So yeah, they jumped up and they argued and they inserted, and there was civil disobedience, and that's something that we in the African community in general, the African American community in general, do realize that sometimes work, and it's very, very necessary. And I heard people say, but Bernie Sanders, and I was like, why are you telling me how I should feel about Bernie Sanders? Because you're trying to do exactly what many of your ancestors tried to do, and that's selling me a white Messiah, and I'm passing on all white Jesuses. So no, I'm going to say that that African Americans need to do much more for themselves and defining what their political stance is going to be. So don't tell me what blackness is. Don't tell me, who is supporting me, because, like I said, I'm going to pass on that sale.
Yeah, my favorite meme that came out of that whole situation was the Samuel L. Jackson from Pulp Fiction, and it said, "Say he marched with MLK one more goddamn time."
That's right. That's right.
And that was just,
that's right.
I mean, as a white ally, I feel like I understand some of these things as much as a white ally can. And I was just thinking to myself, like, I'm not even sure that it's my place to inject my opinion into this conversation, but I just keep thinking to myself, like, so he marched with MLK. So what? Yeah. Like, what does that matter if he's not living out those values now? And if the people who are on the receiving end of that policy don't feel like they're being properly represented, what would I do in that position?
Exactly. Exactly.
Mandisa, what do you think?
Well, I may take a slightly different view to Alex here, and certainly everything he says is correct. Again, this goes back to trying to define how people should act, and how people should feel. I am just still for the creed of my organization is what I follow. I determine the truth and morality and anything through reason and evidence. And so I think that everything should be put under a microscope and examined and also, just examined. And because certainly, I don't agree that, it's always that. It's almost like that tokenism, if you will. Like people say, well, I have black friends, or point to this person. It's almost like Alex said, saying that, selling the Messiah. We certainly don't. And unfortunately, there's still too much of a savior's mentality when it comes to all people. It's like we're looking for the very few to still carry the many. And many people don't realize that it is going to take much more than that. Just like we can't totally validate Bernie Sanders because we marched with Martin Luther King. Certainly, some of the black folks that marched with him too turned out to be less than, we certainly, they certainly had to come under scrutiny as well. So it's, so I'm just saying that all of it, if we really, really are honest with ourselves about wanting change and progression, there is this sense of, there is a lot that we will need to re-examine. And we don't have the right to police how people feel, only if they're coming from an uninformed place, and even if what those young ladies did, or if some people, even what they do is something that I wouldn't necessarily do, I'm certainly not going to stomp on their right to do it, because it will take all kinds. It will take all kinds of activism, and people need to understand that there are different forms of activism out here. It isn't just those that are on the front lines. There's a lot that people don't understand that goes on behind the scenes that are just as important. And that all needs to be recognized and understood and supported.
Yeah, because I remember there was an LGBT conference, and this was just a few months before the Bernie Sanders quote unquote incident, and something kind of similar happened where a group of trans people stormed the stage and took the mic. Because they felt that the conference was just completely excluding the trans community. And I remember thinking to myself when that happened, like, those people are heroes. Because so often we feel so invisible, even in the LGBT movement, and our concerns get pushed aside. So I just thought to myself, like, I'm not black. I don't understand what it's like to live under systemic racism, but like, I mean, that seems to be a similar situation. So like, if that's what they feel like they have to do, then I'm gonna get behind it. You know what I mean? Why wouldn't we want people like that on stage instead of an old white guy saying the same thing over and over again?
Right. Empathy is something that I find is extremely important. I won't discount it. I won't discredit anyone who shows it and is genuine about it. I think that is going to be, something that is extremely crucial, especially when it comes to really working on and really addressing the issues of diversity within both the Black and secular communities, because certainly it is intersectional as the LGBT movement and the LGBT community does play a part in this as well. So being able to empathize and understand, even if most likely will never experience it, is certainly a quality that I take into consideration. Because to me it means a lot. That means that as human beings we are able to relate on a huge level. And I will just say for the record that Black Nonbelievers is a very pro-LGBT organization. We support and it says this right on our front page of our website, that we welcome anyone regardless of sex, sexuality, gender identity, and then all that other good stuff. So if you're going to come to any of us, on that, well, they shouldn't be included, then no, that is unacceptable to us.
Yeah, that's a line that I kind of try and walk the line between, empathy and understanding. And, there's a lot that, because I spend a lot of time talking to people about trans issues. So like, I'm usually the one preaching at other people about how they can be better allies to people like me. And when it comes to issues of racial justice, it's my turn to be an ally. So then I have to turn around and take my own advice, which is something that most of us aren't good at.
Right. Right. Yes.
So because honestly, the thing that got me and this is something that I'm not super proud of. I used to be super racist. I mean, even as an atheist, even, struggling with my own gender identity and that kind of thing. I wasn't overt, like, white hood wearing, racist, But I had lots of those problematic views about, like, well, if black people can say something about white people, why can't I say something about black people? And all of those, like,
how dare you,
right? In what opened my eyes to that is after I came out as trans, I would go into these online discussions and I would be talking to people about, how society treats me as a trans person and what my experience is like. And everyone would be talking down to me about how I'm supposed to feel about it, how I'm supposed to deal with it, that what I'm saying isn't really happening or it's not really as bad. And then I would get involved in conversations surrounding race and I would see the exact same thing happening. And I was like, wow, I've been doing this my entire life. So, I think there's, like you said, empathy is super important, but I definitely don't want to because I've had somebody say words, verbatim, like, oh yeah, like, being trans has got to be really hard. Like, I know what you're going through. Like, cause I got made fun of for being fat in school. So I know exactly what that's all about. And I'm just like, no guys, that's
right.
not.
That isn't the same. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I appreciate your trying,
right.
But
I am very much a proponent of people choosing their words carefully. Right. Some would define that as tone policing, but there is a certain there are times when it is very important.
Well, language matters.
Language does matter, and how you say things matter. Because if you're coming across very condescending and very like everything, then people are going to turn away from you, especially for those of us who are really trying to work on something. If you're coming across like that you are just an authority on this, then yes, that's very much going to be a turnoff.
Today in school, I learned a lot. In chemistry, I learned that no one likes me. In English, I learned that I'm disgusting. And in physics, I learned that I'm a loser.
Today in school, I learned that I'm ugly and useless. And in gym, I learned that I'm pathetic and a joke. In history, I learned that I'm trash.
Today in school, I learned that I have no friends. In English, I learned that I make people sick. And at lunch, I learned that I sit on my own because I smell. In chemistry, I learned that no one likes me.
In biology, I learned that I'm fat and stupid. And in math, I learned that I'm trash.
The only thing I didn't learn in school today?
The only thing I didn't learn today?
The only thing I didn't learn
is why no one ever helps.
Kids witness bullying every day. They want to help, but they don't know how. Teach them how to stop bullying and be more than a bystander at stopbullying.gov.
The staff of Secular Coalition for America lobbies U.S. Congress on issues of separation of church and state, and they've become a powerhouse for change in the United States government. You'll definitely want to subscribe to receive their email action alerts. These are updates for important issues and ones that you can get involved with directly. And hopefully, you'll consider making a contribution to the Secular Coalition for America to help them continue fighting for your equality. You can do it all at secular.org.
One of the things that I always like to do towards the end of the show is a segment where we literally talk about how we can be better allies. So I would love to hear from both of you, both in the secular context and in the more general context. I mean, how can we be better allies to people of color, and how can we help advance that cause?
Everyone needs to just be black.
So you're endorsing me doing blackface then? Is that what I'm hearing?
No. But what I'm endorsing is a different type of cultural appropriation. No, actually, what I actually think is important is discomfort and getting uncomfortable with becoming comfortable with your discomfort, because it's a reality.
I love that.
You don't change because you're comfortable. You change because you're not. And putting yourself in conversations and in structural context where you are challenging, you're constantly challenging what you think is true, what you think your reality is very important. And, a lot of times, regardless of the degree or access of privilege, people have a hard time checking it, right? Even when I was moving out there and becoming more visible, I'm talking about years ago when I was putting myself out there, I had people that would try and define and tell me how I should do it and what I should be saying, et cetera. I was like, wait, you are telling me what I should be talking to African Americans about, but you're not. So, it took a lot of empathy on my part, but it also took people becoming comfortable in their discomfort and being able to have these honest conversations like these in regards to where we really are in terms of race. And people don't like to be told that they are privileged. Fragility is very, very real. And so I tell allies, if you want to be a better ally, if you feel safe, then you're doing it wrong, because you shouldn't be. You need to be putting yourself out there with us, but understand that being out there with us doesn't necessarily mean that you're in the forefront or telling us what to do, but that also means that you're not disintermediating yourself from my struggle, right? I mean, when the Bernie Sanders thing happened, when the BLM thing happened, one of the things that bothered me a whole lot was people that calling themselves an ally, jumping up and saying, "Don't you know that it hurts your cause?" And I was like, well, you're just telling me right now in that sentence that you're not my ally because If you are a humanist, and I consider myself a humanist, and I think Black Lives Matter in the context of the conversation that we're happening, which is always in the context of all lives mattering, but we're talking specifically about Black lives because they don't matter in that context. If you're saying us versus them, you're no longer really considering yourself an ally. You're taking yourself out of that equation. So you need to really begin to address where you think you really fit in that conversation. So I always tell people that you need to really reassess where you think you stand. And just because you call yourself an ally doesn't mean that you are. And this is something that I've said before several times. You don't get to determine that you're an ally. I do, right? Because I get to evaluate through not just word but deed whether you're an ally. And that's something that people really need to get comfortable in their discomfort accepting. So that's my 30 seconds on it.
Yeah, I mean, how many times have you been told, like, oh, I'm an ally, I support you, why can't you just accept that?
Right.
Oh, it's so annoying. Mandisa, what are your thoughts?
Well, Alex, it sounds to me like Alex is just encouraging every white ally to go straight to the hood. And no, I'm just kidding. And just to be and to risk getting shot. No, I'm just kidding. I'm totally kidding about that. I do agree with what he says 100%. Is that people will have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and being honest that it makes them uncomfortable. Try not to get defensive, and this is something that is difficult even for me to do. To not become defensive. When we talk about the issues that pertain to our community and what has been lacking, it isn't personal. It is a valid observance, and you don't get to police what we experience and also what has been shown. And one of the best ways to be an ally is to admit that, or is to say that, okay, even if I've never thought about it before, I do want to help. And when we tell you that these are the ways you can help, listen to us. Listen to what we are saying. Certainly we can use the support in carrying these things out too. Certainly pointing people to different resources and places where they can go, offer solutions and, not just talk about it, but as I say, in the words of one of my presentations, be about it. Be genuine, follow through. It cannot be just a one-time conversation. It has to be something that is ongoing.
Well said. Well, I want to seriously thank both of you for taking the time out here. I had a very strong feeling that this was going to be a great conversation, and I think it has. I think these are super important things. I mean, both in the secular community and in obviously in the world in general, because we're not going to make everybody atheists. So thank you both so much for coming on and just and being real, because that's what I. That's what I always shoot for. So, Alex and Mandisa, thank you both so much for coming on.
Thank you so much for having us. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto on Secular Media Network. I want to thank my guests, Mandisa Thomas and Alix Jules, once again. You can find the show on Facebook at facebook.com/thegaytheistmanifesto. You can email us at thegaytheistmanifesto@gmail.com. I'm on Twitter at GaytheistCali, and you can find the show on Twitter at The Gaytheists. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.